When he started introducing more of these romantic comments, yeah, I was panicked. And I told him that I wasn't comfortable with it. And he just wouldn't stop. And I kept thinking, if I just make him understand that I'm not okay with it, he'll stop. And it can go back to being safe and good again. He fell in love with me accidentally, but he's not going to hurt me in any way. And we're not doing anything physically. And as long as he reins it in a little bit and realizes I'm not going to reciprocate these romantic feelings, and it can go back, then it's, I thought everything was good up until then. I didn't realize everything was wrong from day one.
I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist chair. In our last episode, we started sharing the story of Amy Nordhues. If you haven't listened to that yet, I'd strongly recommend starting there. We covered the first phases of Amy's work with Dr. Dolian, who at first just seemed like a goofy and sweet old man. Little did she know that from the very beginning, he'd been laying the groundwork for his most blatant abuses. It was a classic grooming pattern. One seemingly small step at a time, always patiently waiting for the victim's guard to go back down before the next advance. I realize some of you may bristle at the word grooming here. There's a common assumption that grooming only occurs in the abuse of children, not full-grown adults who are capable of making their own decisions. So many of the survivors I've spoken with say they struggle with the idea that they might have been groomed by their abuser. I'm not a child, the reasoning goes. I should be capable of thinking for myself. And this was certainly true in my story. After I left my harmful therapist, I talked with 2 different psychologists about my experience. Both professionals insisted this was grooming behavior. But I vehemently denied it, asserting my agency as an adult. Even as I detailed grooming behaviors in my complaint to the state, I was adamant I was not being groomed. It took close to a year before I gained some perspective, before I was able to step back and see it for what it was. Cultural anthropologist Jerrica Heinze is a leading expert on the very real dynamics of grooming in the abuse of adults. She describes it as a grand orchestration, an extreme sense of false emotional connection that the individual builds over time. And it's absolutely crucial to realize this can happen to any one of us. It doesn't matter how old you are, how mature, wise, or professional. We all have vulnerabilities and blind spots. And skilled groomers are pros at reading those areas and finding a foothold for leverage. They then project a very specific image of themselves. In Amy's case, Dr. Dolian presented himself as the supportive father figure she'd always lacked. The picture he painted pried open Amy's vulnerabilities, giving him an immense amount of power to manipulate her. Grooming is all about the abuser presenting a carefully curated image of themselves to earn the victim's absolute trust. Meanwhile, they work to isolate the victim, instilling the sense that there's no one else they could trust, nowhere else they can go for support. This completely muddies the water of any notion of agency and consent, even if the victim is a perfectly competent adult in every other area of their life. And even though it can start in small and subtle ways, the groomer has their end goal in mind the entire time. Whether it's sexual abuse, financial exploitation, the need to wield power over others, or any number of other nefarious aims. Part of what is so sinister about all of this is that it can be extremely difficult to recognize in the moment. And in Amy's case, it was even harder, because Dr. Dolian was propped up by the community around them. He was a respected elder in the church they both attended, and Amy had heard plenty of people rave about his work as a therapist. Whenever she did feel uneasy about what was going on between them, she didn't think she could talk to anyone about it. Who were they going to believe? The well-credentialed clinician they all knew and loved, or the broken younger woman in his care? The psychiatrist Judith Herman has been arguing for decades trauma's a social problem at its core, not just an individual one. She writes powerfully about this in her book, Trauma and Recovery. I'd like to read a passage from that. It is very tempting to take the side of the perpetrator. All the perpetrator asks is that the bystander do nothing. He appeals to the universal desire to see, hear, and speak no evil. The victim, on the contrary, asks the bystander to share in the burden of pain. The victim demands action, engagement, and remembering. In order to escape accountability for his crimes, the perpetrator does everything in his power to promote forgetting. Secrecy and silence are the perpetrator's first line of defense. If secrecy fails, the perpetrator attacks the credibility of the victim. If he cannot silence her absolutely, he tries to make sure that no one listens. To this end, he marshals an impressive array of arguments, from the most blatant denial to the most sophisticated and elegant rationalization. After every atrocity, one can expect to hear the same predictable apologies. It never happened. The victim lies. The victim exaggerates. The victim brought it upon herself. And in any case, it is time to forget the past and move on. The more powerful the perpetrator, the greater his prerogative to name and define reality, and the more completely his arguments prevail. The perpetrator's arguments prove irresistible when the bystander faces them in isolation, and the bystander usually succumbs to the temptation to look the other way." End quote. At one point, Amy tried talking with the pastor's wife, who'd been sort of a mentor to her. She told her about the foot rubs and dancing and how uncomfortable it made her. But the pastor's wife laughed and said, "Sounded kind of sweet." Amy pressed a bit further and said he'd even placed his hands on her butt while they were dancing. But the pastor's wife glared at her and said, "I trust him implicitly." Amy decided to reach out to a therapist that she had seen in the past to ask what she should do if a clinician falls in love with you. The therapist said to call her, but Amy could not go through with it. She knew what the answer would be. She knew she'd be advised to stop seeing Dr. Dolian, and she did not think she'd be able to leave him. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe she could still fix things and get her therapy back on track. But then Dr. Dolian stepped things up once again. And this time, there was no pretext, no denying what was going on.
Probably towards the end of May is when he just, in the middle of therapy, me talking, crying, he just assaults me. And I pushed him away, twisted my body around, and I just started bawling. And I think it was the darkest moment of my life, to be quite honest, because I thought he was a hero. And I guess I didn't think I still had emotions about it. But it was just like the room went black and the whole world went black. And I just kept saying, "I can't believe you would do this to me. I can't believe you would do this to me."
Amy knew there was no explaining this one away. He'd finally made his intentions blatant enough and in such a grotesque way, and she knew she couldn't cover for him or try to justify his behavior any longer. She was in so much pain, and she felt so alone. She didn't even want to tell anybody about it, not even her husband, because she worried people would blame her. Well, you did let him sit next to you, they might say. Or, weren't you the one who first brought up wanting to dance? Her husband and kids left town that weekend, and Amy stayed home in bed. In the depths of her grief and loneliness, the clarity of Dr. Dolian's abuse once again started growing murky. Maybe if she hadn't been so needy, this wouldn't have happened. Or if she hadn't so deeply wanted a father figure, maybe he wouldn't have gotten so attached. And besides, when he called that weekend, he just sounded so sorry.
I went to his office on a Saturday. He apologized, sort of, and managed to produce one tear And I remember he said, I only wanted you to feel loved. And I immediately went from, I hate you, I can't believe you did this to me, to I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Like I caused him to stumble. And now I've caused him this pain for making him do this thing to me. It's just crazy. It's crazy to me. So I go back. I'm very cautious. I tell him I'm cautious. I apologize, of course. I say, sorry, but it's going to take me time to trust again. Can you imagine? I'm saying I'm sorry. And he's like, no, I understand. And I truly don't think it will ever happen again. Yes, I am distressed that he's professing more like loving feeling towards me and the emotional stuff, but I don't think physically or sexually he would ever do anything again.
Maybe the most confusing part of it all was that she still felt so attached and dependent on him. Sometimes it seemed like he was all she had. At that point, Amy didn't know what she knows now about the grooming process, about how steadily and intentionally her relationship with Dr. Dolian had been building to this moment from day one. In her eyes, this was the first real slip-up. She couldn't just abandon him after one mistake, right? Especially if it was at least partially her fault.
I didn't really understand why I was so attached. I didn't really understand why it felt so hard to leave. I just knew that it felt like he was a drug that I needed. It felt like he gave me something that I needed, and I don't even know what that thing was. I joke in my book that for my husband to really listen to me, he'd actually have to pause the TV remote. And, that's not to fault my husband either. It's just that in the real world, even in our marriages, we're not always that connected. And it wasn't just that I felt attached to him. It was also that I felt guilty leaving him. I felt like he needed me. And he was this broken soul. And he'd done so much for me. How can I just abandon him now?
For the next few sessions, things did seem normal again. Maybe he really was sorry. Maybe it was just that one mistake. And then in June, right when Amy might have been ready to let her guard back down, he started crossing lines again. Amy didn't know why, but she still could not bring herself to speak up and say no. She doesn't want to go into details about what occurred next, but it was definitely sexual assault. And it happened again each of the next few sessions. Amy had run out of justifications for him, and she was starting to come to terms with the fact that his behavior wasn't going to change.
On the last session, I say, in tears, can we just leave clothes on and talk? Will you just talk to me? I'm begging my therapist to just talk to me, which is just the most pitiful thing I can ever imagine. But it wasn't so much what he said, but just the look that he gave me and the cruel laugh that he gave. And he said something like, sure, what do you want to talk about? We can talk about the weather. And then he mentioned a whole lot of things that he knew I hated. And I could just see pure cruelty on his face. And I knew that he did not care one iota that he was hurting me. He had no intentions of stopping. And I meant nothing to him. Nothing. And that was what it took for me to not go back. However, I needed support for that. So I went back to my pastor's wife, tried to tell her. She didn't want to hear it.
So Amy decided to go directly to the pastor and told him everything with his wife in the room. She then asked if they would sit with her during her next appointment slot. She didn't trust herself not to give in and go back to Dr. Dolian. So during the 3 hours that would have been her next session, she sat on the pastor's couch and cried and cried. Well, Dr. Dolian called her nearly 10 times and kept leaving voicemails. When she made it through those 3 hours, she felt so proud of herself. She knew the tie wasn't completely severed yet, but for the first time, she was sure she wouldn't go back to him. Right after this, Amy went on vacation with a friend to Canada. The trip had been planned earlier, but the timing turned out to be really great. The distance helped her think about her next steps and helped her to continue processing everything that had happened. Her friend was a therapist, and she told Amy that she was licensed to report Dr. Dolian to the medical board. Amy resisted this at first, but eventually she said yes. When she got back home, she knew it was time to finally tell her husband.
When you first leave an abuser like this, you still think so much is your fault. And so you feel like you're confessing instead of explaining what was done to you. It's so unfair. So essentially, that was kind of the version I gave. This is what happened. I didn't want it. I can't explain it. I don't know why I stayed. I don't know why I couldn't leave. And I'm so sorry. And he at first treated it like an affair, which was my fear, which was why I wasn't going to tell him. Why should my marriage and my entire family be torn apart because of something that somebody did to me? And how am I going to explain that I didn't want it when I don't really fully understand why I stayed so long? He eventually understood that that was not something I would do in a million years, and that I would be very easily manipulated to have a father figure, and that it wasn't an affair, that it was abuse. It was brutal, the process we had to go through to get there, because I was trying to keep my head above water and survive while he was processing feelings of hurt and betrayal and anger, which isn't fair, but is fair. And I had this wonderful psychologist who I met through the website Tell, Dr. Gary Schroner, and he was generous enough to talk to me on the phone. And he said, "Amy, have you told your husband?" And I said, "Yes, I told him everything." And he said, "Well, that's a shame, because the first thing I do with couples in this situation is sit them down and inform the spouse, the husband, that your wife was a victim of a crime, and victims of crime don't owe an explanation to anyone." And I just started crying. Yes, but it took him telling me that I had that right for me to feel like, yes, I have that right. And it seems like with sexual assault, victims aren't given that right. It seems like if we explain ourselves and we prove it, maybe some people will see the harm in it. And it's because people don't want to believe that their trusted church leaders and therapists and doctors are wolves in sheep clothing. They don't want to admit that they were duped as well. It's much easier to throw the victim under the bus. Because if it's just me, if I'm just some broken girl that was in therapy, then it doesn't have to rock their whole world. They can keep their little bubble intact, their little illusion that he's this safe, sweet, kind, grandfatherly Christian man, and then they can keep on trucking.
Amy's language about wolves in sheep's clothing is so apt. Why is this such a common story in so many churches? The respected leader who turns out to be somebody much different than everyone thought. Somebody much more dangerous. Martin Buber, an Austrian Jewish philosopher, had an interesting take on this. He wrote, "Since the primary motive of evil is disguise, one of the places evil people are most likely to be found is within the church. What better way to conceal one's evil from oneself, as well as from others, than to be a deacon or some highly visible form of Christian within our culture? I do not mean to imply that the evil are anything other than a small minority among the religious, or the religious motives of most people are in any way spurious. I mean only that evil people tend to gravitate toward piety for the disguise and concealment it can offer them." End quote. Right when Amy was working up the courage to submit her own report, the medical board reached out to Amy because of her friend's report. By that point, it felt like she and her husband were on the same team, and she was finally ready to pursue some form of accountability. The process took about 9 months, and instead of the full trial that would have been necessary for the board to take his license, Dr. Dolian decided to surrender it instead. One of only 5 permanent surrenders in 20 years. It was a bit like that feeling when a funeral ends and everyone goes home. There's a sense of completion, sure, but it's far from something to celebrate. She felt a giant void in her life, and it seemed like things were falling apart around her. Her marriage was shaky. Her kids had been affected. She was losing friends and her church family. Meanwhile, Dr. Dolian gets to saunter off into the sunset of happy retirement. So eventually she started to reach out to attorneys, and she quickly learned it would not be an easy, straightforward process.
You have to speak to an attorney that understands abuse of power. And so I finally find an attorney that's skilled in abuse of power. And he said, since therapist abuse is not illegal in your state, that it would be a very bad idea to pursue criminal charges, that they would destroy you and your family, and he would likely walk.
The next option was a civil malpractice lawsuit. That was delayed when Dr. Dolian filed for bankruptcy, and it ended up taking about 3 years. But eventually the lawsuit was successful. As successful as it could be, at least. It was technically against the insurance company. not Dr. Dolian himself. And Amy says it all felt very transactional, way too cold and businesslike for such raw human pain. And it was hard to hear her story dissected in legalese, to hear the brutalities she'd endured watered down to, quote unquote, sexual misconduct. But there was something healing about how hard her attorneys fought for her, and about how outraged some of the doctors on the medical board seemed to be on her behalf. It even felt healing to some of her childhood wounds. She'd never had total strangers stand up for her like that. And she was standing up for herself, too, which certainly had not always been easy. She was proud of herself for speaking up, for acting on the conviction that nothing about this was right.
The defense attorney, during my 6-hour deposition, was mocking me and saying, "You're just doing this to get money." And I said, "No, I'm actually doing it because this was the only avenue of justice that was available to me. So I took it." Some victims will feel guilty even that they're suing their abuser when these abusers should be criminally charged, when there's people that commit lesser offenses that get criminally charged and get put on sex offender registry lists. And these guys, yeah, if they lose their license, that's something, but it just is hardly fair.
At the end of the trial, Amy was able to read the investigative report, and she learned that Dr. Dolian had confessed to the grooming and predatory behavior. He admitted that he would make a move and then watch her reaction. He admitted to backing off when needed, waiting until she was comfortable, and then trying again. This was validating for Amy. Black and white evidence that his behavior was as intentional and sinister as she had come to believe. But his story outside the trial was very different. He might refer vaguely to having, crossed boundaries, but his telling it was such a sob story. He was the unfortunate professional who'd been undermined by a broken and unstable patient. He did agree to step down as an elder and leave the church they both attended, which only fueled the rumor mill. It was a small town and an even smaller church community, and it was devastating when the gossip confirmed Amy's fears, that people would blame her and pity Dr. Dolian, that he'd still be the respected old man and she would be the crazy, problematic woman. Even the pastor, who'd seemed supportive at first, eventually went into damage control mode. The local news came to interview him. Everyone loves a good scandal, after all. And he tried to play both sides, saying it was a sad story all around, and he wanted to make sure both Amy and Dr. Dolian got the help they needed. She told the pastor how hurtful this was, and that if he couldn't treat her like if one of his own daughters had been harmed, she'd prefer that he didn't speak to her at all. It was way too much for Amy, the gossip, the mischaracterizations, the feelings of abandonment and betrayal. She tried to hold her head up high and not let herself be run off. But what was the point of sticking with community if they wouldn't stick with her? To quote Judith Herman again, traumatic events shatter the sense of connection between the individual and community, creating a crisis of faith.
Sometimes I think the secondary traumas we go through are worse. I don't know why, but maybe because we're already down. But I get this kind of behavior from a sociopath. I didn't expect it from my best friend or from the pastor. The gossip mill was in full swing because, as it often plays out, the pastor didn't share the facts with the congregation, right? So it's the doctor and his wife who have been members of this church for, 30 years, on the prayer team, in a small group for 20 years. It's their version against mine. Nobody even knows who I am. I've been going to that church for 1 year. And ironically, I found another victim because one Sunday after church, a church member went up to this other victim and said, "Did you hear what that girl," being me, "did to the doctor, to Dr. Dolian? Did you hear that girl has done that to tons of doctors?" And something in her snapped and she said, "I don't know that girl, but I can tell you that what he did to her, he did to me, and you need to go back to your source and stop spreading lies."
Finding another victim was so validating for Amy, and she was also able to find some support from a few other people. When she talked about it with her primary care doctor, trying to find out if she believed her or not, the doctor said, "Amy, we know doctors don't surrender their license when they're innocent." And another doctor who was also in a small group at the church told Amy he believed her too. She asked if he knew what Dr. Dolian was saying about her around town.
He was telling people that I was delusional and that I had imagined it all. It just infuriated me. And that's one of the reasons that I fought back with reporting him in a civil suit, because what are you going to do if you're mentally ill? How are you going to stand up against a psychiatrist when a psychiatrist can say whatever they want to about you? Write whatever they want to in your notes. They can say that you have any number of mental illnesses. And on top of that, what if you really do? How are you supposed to fight? And oh, that made me upset.
At one point, Amy did receive the sorry, not sorry email from Dr. Dolian. You know the type. Maybe enough to check the box of an apology without ever actually apologizing. She got a more sincere apology from the pastor's wife, who told her she was sorry she didn't believe her at first. Amy was moved by this and thought maybe they could mend their friendship. But then the pastor's wife kept going back and forth in her treatment of Amy. One day she'd act angry toward Dr. Dolian. The next she'd defend him and disparage Amy. Like when Amy said, "I guess we know now why so many doctors have sexual misconduct clauses in their insurance." And the pastor's wife said, "Yeah, because the people who go to them are crazy." Amy wondered if some part of her inconsistency was about guilt for having recommended Dr. Dolian in the first place. Because it turns out she'd recommended another woman to him 20 years earlier, and that woman had committed suicide under his care. Ultimately, Amy wondered why she kept going back to people who were hurting her. She was finally learning to see herself as a person of value. And knowing your value means not returning to people who abuse you, and not sticking with communities that turn their back on you. So she decided to let them go. She still considers herself a very spiritual person.
In the very early days, I just needed to know I wasn't alone. So reaching out to Tell, the website, reading every book I could find on firsthand experiences of this kind of abuse, whether it's clergy or therapists, I saw so many similarities, and I just thought, oh, okay, these are normal women. These are intelligent women like me. These are educated women. So it can't just be me. I can't be a loser if it happens to all of us.
Amy needed to tell her story again and again as she kept trying to make sense of it all. So she started writing. And by committing her story to the page, she was able to see even more clearly how thorough the grooming process had been from day one. She was also able to start working towards self-compassion, not berating herself for being unable to leave sooner. You can see the results of that labor in her book, titled Preyed Upon. That is hard work, though, and she knew she needed help, so she decided not to give up on therapy entirely.
I still know there's good therapists out there. I still found a therapist that was wonderful, ethical, tight boundaries, no handshakes, no hugs. It was great. I just went in, did the work, and left.
Amy did find it hard to trust a church community again, but she learned her faith could thrive without the structure of a church. And she continues to share her story and advocate for others through her writing and speaking. You can learn more about Amy and her work and connect with her through her website, amynordhues.com. You can find Amy's book, Preyed Upon, on her website, Amazon, and wherever books are sold. Thank you again to this week's guest, Amy Nordhues, for sharing her story. If you have found value in today's episode, please consider leaving us a rating and review. Your feedback helps us to grow and learn. If you'd like to share your story or support someone else in sharing theirs, you can reach out to me at podcast.psychotherapy@gmail.com or connect with me on Instagram at podcast.psychotherapy. And as always, thank you to the writer of this show, Bo Denton, for your skill and insight. To our audience, thank you for listening. I hope you'll join us again next time.